Cortez. I'm a graduate student here at the School of Education. I am very excited to introduce today's speaker. It's going to be an exciting talk. And before we begin, I think it would be good for the speaker as well as for all of us here in the room to kind of get a sense of who's here. So raise your hand if you are interested in the field of education. Nice. Great. Raise your hand if you're a student exploring educational themes. Nice. Very well, very well. And raise your hand if you identify with being a teacher now or at some time in your past. Okay, got quite a few teachers here. Nice job. For those brave souls that raised your hands and outed yourself as a teacher, thank you. It's an important time. Doing so, outing yourself as a teacher in today's climate, reminiscent of the McCarthy era, kind of positions you as what's wrong with our educational system today. Today, Dr. Kevin Kumashiro is here to provide a rebuttal to that framework as he introduces us to his newest book, Bad Teacher, How Blaming Teachers Distorts the Bigger Picture. Dr. Kumashiro is a professor of Asian American Studies and Education at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he was formerly chair of the Department of Educational Policy Studies. He has taught in schools and colleges across the United States and abroad, and has served as a consultant for schools, districts, organizations, and agencies. He has authored or edited 8 books, including one of my personal favorites, Troubling Education. His more recent books include Against Common Sense, Teaching and Learning Toward Social Justice, and The Seduction of Common Sense, How the Right Has Framed the Debate on America's Schools. Those are 2 different books, just in case. One was Against Common Sense, and the other was The Seduction of Common Sense. In 2002, he founded the Center for Anti-Oppressive Education, and in 2012, this year, he has become the president of the National Association of Multicultural Education. So on behalf of the Graduate School of Education and the Berkeley Review of Education, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Kevin Kumashiro.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for coming. It's such an honor to be back at UIC. I keep saying UIC. I don't know why I keep saying that. I'm at UIC at University of Illinois Chicago. It's great to be back at Berkeley, and thanks especially to Arturo Cortez and Berkeley Review of Education leaders for inviting me and for making it possible for me to spend this evening with all of you. I do a lot of travels to give talks on different presentations, and I like to give thank you gifts every time I visit a different place. And I thought, well, what more valuable gift can I give than a copy of one of my own books? So I thought I would give a copy of Seduction of Common Sense to Arturo, and as a thank you for inviting me here. And I also wanted to mention that, Arturo mentioned that I'm the next president of the National Association for Multicultural Education. I hope that all of you will consider getting involved. We have an annual conference. This year, the annual conference will be at the weekend after Thanksgiving in Philadelphia. And I mentioned NAME as a way to say that it's not only a great opportunity to connect with people around the country and the world doing multicultural and social justice-oriented work, but also within your regions in the state. And so NAME has formed a new California chapter just half a year ago, and we have Southern California and the Northern California region of that chapter. So feel free to come up to me afterwards, unless there are any of the NAME California organizers in this room, here in this room. No, then come up and see me afterwards, and I can definitely get you connected. So I'd like to talk today about my newest book, Bad Teacher, How Blaming Teachers Distorts the Bigger Picture. And I thought I'd begin by telling a story. So the story comes from a book by Lani Guinier. Many of you know Lani Guinier. She kind of reached national prominence in the 1990s when she was nominated by then President Clinton for a civil rights position in the federal government. While controversy ensued, she remains a professor of law at Harvard University. And a book that she wrote a few years ago is called The Miner's Canary. And so the story I take comes from chapter 4 of Miner's Canary. And it's a story where she's at a family party, and a lot of the very young children are outside in the yard doing a relay race. So they're racing against one another. It's the game where you have to kind of carry a golf ball in a spoon and you run to the next person, you pass the ball on, and you see who can get it to the other side as fast as possible. And it was girls versus boys. Girls won. And so the boys demanded a rematch, and the girls won again. So Grenier is basically saying, you know, a lot of her people in her family are like her, academics. And what do we do best in a situation like this? We sit on the side and we try to analyze it. So that's exactly what they were doing. And they were asking questions like, well, why are the girls winning? What is it about the girls? Are they more coordinated? Are they more patient? Why aren't the boys winning? What's up with the boys? And until finally, one of the grandmothers, or the grandmothers of one of the children, kind of paused the conversation by saying, well, who is it that made up the rules for this game? And what Grenier argues is that that was a story that helped her to think about how, when we're trying to make sense of a conflict or a competition, we tend to ask only certain kinds of questions. And yet there are certain kinds of questions that are perhaps the more important questions that we need to be asking, right, that rarely get asked. So she tells us that there are 3 kinds of questions that we need to be asking. One, the question that we tend to ask most often is, who is winning and who is losing? This is the question that we were asking with the relay race, right? And the implication is that if we can figure out why the winners are winning, maybe we can help the losers to compete better. Maybe we can help them to win. In other words, maybe we can fix the losers, right? The second kind of question, though, is reflected by the question that the grandmother asked. And that is, who made the rules to this game? Who made the rules to this game? And she urges us to ask that question by recognizing and reminding us that it's often the people in positions of power who make the rules to the game, and we make those rules in ways that advantage us in the competition. Right? In other words, it's not surprising that the girls chose, well, I'm sorry, let's backtrack. It's not the case that girls are naturally more inclined to win a game like that. But it is not surprising that they would choose a game where they were more likely to win, and where in fact they did win twice. Right? There's a third type of question, though, that we almost never ask, that Grenier argues is perhaps the most significant question of them all. And that question is, what is the story that we tell the losers to get them to want to continue playing? And her argument is that, you know, the boys knew that the girls chose the game. They knew that they were losing, right? They saw that they were losing, but they insisted on continuing to play because they were buying into the story that there is something fair about the game, that they had a chance to win, that they could win, right? Well, let's take these 3 questions and apply them to certain problems in education to see if it helps us to complicate our understanding of what actually is the problem, right? So one problem that I like to look at with these 3 questions is the problem of testing. So lots of problems around standardized high-stakes testing, right? So the first question, who is winning and who is losing, is often answered by looking at what many call the achievement gap, right? So we think we can measure learning with standardized tests. When we look at standardized tests, we see a gap, right? We see that certain students are performing at one level, and below a gap, a whole bunch of other students are performing. And the whole kind of, the goal of a lot of initiatives that are all about closing the gap, right? Bringing the scores of some people up to the scores of others, is about helping certain students better perform on the test, right? It's about basically helping, it's about fixing the losers in that competition, right? Well, what's another way to think about the problem with testing? It's really with the second question, right? Who made the rules to this game? And I think one way to think about how this applies to testing is to think about how are tests constructed. So for decades, we've seen people talk about the problems of culture bias in tests, right? For decades, we've seen people talk about the problems of tests not actually aligning with what it is that you're trying to teach, right? So culture bias and curricular non-alignment are 2 things that we've heard people say very often. For decades, really, people have been making these arguments around why the use of tests are problematic. There's a third problem, though, that I think is significant for this analysis, and that is the nature of norm reference testing, right? Of how we produce norm reference tests. So many of you are probably aware that there are certain questions that appear on tests like the ACT and the SAT that don't actually count towards your score, right? There are questions that appear because they are They're kind of like the sample questions. They're questions that the test makers are putting in there to see how the group of test takers as a whole perform. And if the distribution of those if the distribution of the scores on those questions look like the distribution of the scores overall, then that is an indication that this is a good test question, right? Because if a whole bunch of students who are performing well on the test overall are all bombing on that question, then clearly that question isn't giving us the kinds of results that we want. Or so the test makers would say, right? This is the nature of norm reference testing, right? It's referenced to a norm. It's all about referencing your performance to the majority. Well, what does that mean? It means that tests are created in ways that reinforce the distribution that we want to see, right? Tests are made, in other words, in many ways to reinforce the status quo. And this should lead us to then the third question that Guinier is asking, which is what is the story that we tell the losers to get them to want to continue playing? And here I like to think about how many people that I work with, sometimes even I, very critical of standardized tests, but we're the same ones who then return and kind of rely on tests as evidence that certain things are working, right? So those of us who are kind of talking from multicultural perspectives, for example, we're all about pushing for culturally relevant teaching, student-centered instruction, right? Teacher-generated curriculums, locally developed curriculums. And the argument is often framed in such a way, in a way like this. Well, these are great things. And what's the evidence that they're working with our students? Look at the test scores, right? In other words, we're still buying into the story that the tests are fair, that the tests are accurate, and that the tests are valid, right? Let's take these three questions and ask if they help us to complicate more broadly problems in education. So, problems with public education more broadly. Let's look at the first question, who's winning and who's losing? Gloria Ladson-Billings, 6 years ago, wrote a very groundbreaking article that was about reframing the achievement gap, right? And her argument is that the achievement gap is really the tip of a much larger iceberg, a much larger problem of racial and other disparities in education, right? And she points to three major elements of that bigger problem, right? Segregation, inequitable funding, and school governance. Well, in the past few years, these problems all have worsened significantly, right? So a few years ago when I started giving talks about the earlier book that I had written, at the time the Civil Rights Project at UCLA was arguing that we had lost almost all grounds that we had gained from the desegregation movement, right? So 1954 was Brown versus Board of Education, right? And for about 10 years there was actually no movement until 1964 with the Civil Rights Act that we actually began to see a lot of gains with desegregation in our nation's schools. And for about a quarter century, our schools were actually making progress with desegregation, particularly with African American students in the South. But beginning in the late 1980s, as the court-ordered desegregation programs were expiring, we were returning to what we have always used to assign students to schools, which is residence, right? And given that our nation is incredibly racially segregated in our neighborhoods, it should not be surprising that our schools are also going to be incredibly segregated unless we have some kind of a desegregation program, right? Well, in the past few years, we have surpassed the mark, right? In other words, it's not as if we've lost all gains in the desegregation movement. We actually are looking even worse than before, right? Driven in part by programs that claim to actually help to desegregate, right? Driven in part by choice programs. Funding also looks worse. When Jonathan Kozel wrote his book 20 years ago, Savage Inequalities, he kind of points out that a school district can be spending about 3 times as much per student as a district right next door, because so much of school funding is based on local property taxes, right? But wealth inequity has continued to worsen in this country, right? So now it's possible for school districts to be spending more than 4 times as much per student as the district right next door, right? And this should not be surprising. Governance is also looking worse, right? It's not just, so Chicago, where I live, likes to think of itself as a model for school reform all over the country. And in some ways it is, right? In the 1980s, Chicago was seen as a model for decentralizing school governance, right? So we formed all these local school councils. Every school was supposed to have a local school council that consisted of people both in the school and outside of the school, community members, right? And just a few years later, in the mid-1990s, that reversed. And Chicago became seen as a model for school centralization, right? And it's a model that is now, you know, it's a form of governance that actually is seen in school districts all over the country. But my point in terms of what is changing in the past few years is that it's not just school leaders and elected officials who are playing an enormous role in governing schools and making policy decisions. It's also the mega philanthropies and the corporations, right? So this leads to my second question of who's making the rules. There are certain entities that are exerting enormous influence over school reform. One of them being the mega philanthropies like Gates and Broad, right? And what is interesting is that if we look at the research on these venture philanthropies like Gates and Broad, what we're seeing is they often target urban areas, right? They target urban areas with the intention of sort of piloting certain kinds of reforms eventually to scale up, right? What we also see is that, you know, yes, there's millions and millions and millions of dollars within just one city by just one philanthropy, right? It's a lot of money, but still overall with school funding, it's a tiny percentage, right? And yet, my argument is that philanthropies absolutely should be studied because of how they use that wealth, right? And this is where the term venture philanthropy comes from, right? Venture philanthropies are parallel to venture capitalism, right? In other words, venture capitalists are those who leverage their wealth to make more money. And same here, venture philanthropies are leveraging their wealth in order to have more kind of policy and political influence over reform. So too with corporations. There are scholars now arguing that Pearson is exerting influence in a way that corporations have never really exerted over schools before, right? Pearson is tapping into not only the testing market, but also the test prep market, and is one of the most influential lobbyists right now, right? Corporations, mega philanthropies, exerting enormous amounts of influence over school. So why is it though that we're not talking about these things, right? Why is it that we're not talking about the larger problems, segregation, funding? Why is it that we're not talking about who's making and driving a lot of these reforms? This gets to the third question of what's the story that we tell the losers to get them to want to continue playing. And I think the story, perhaps the most dominant story that's framing education discourse today is the story of how markets solve all of our problems, right? Neoliberal ideology is absolutely reigning supreme in this era, and neoliberalism is all about, so here's my sort of shorthand way of thinking about neoliberalism, right? So classic liberalism suggests or argues that justice is the result of lifting constraints on the individual. Right? We get rid of things like governmental constraints so that individuals are as free to act as possible, right? Classic liberalism. What neoliberalism does is it takes that ideal and it situates it in a market-like economy, right? So it says justice is no longer about lifting constraints, it's also about enabling people to really prosper. And how do we most prosper? By actually competing with one another, right? And this is in some ways very commonsensical, right? It kind of makes some sense that, yes, if we can kind of compete, it's our hard work and it's our innovation that's actually going to drive improvement, and that's going to drive our own growth. Well, I'm going to come back to how this metaphor drives so many other things going on in education today. But one of the things that I want to point out is that sometimes that story is so compelling that it doesn't get us to see how the reforms that we're advocating for are actually reforms that are working against our best interests, right? Even when the reforms, in other words, are hurting us, we still sometimes are buying into the underlying story. So let me then extend this conversation. Let me take these three questions from Lonnie Bonnier and apply them more specifically to the attacks on teachers, as I try to kind of make sense of how the attacks on teachers are masking the bigger problems with education. And the way I want to talk about the bigger picture of education is to point to four elements. There's four elements of what I see as the bigger picture. And the first element is what's going on today. So all of these examples are actually things that have come up in the time since I wrote my book. And that was my big concern. Right? I was writing this book last summer. I was very concerned because there's all these protests and problems, and I thought, you know, half a year from now, the situation is going to look really quite different. And there are some phenomenal examples of things going wrong in the time since I wrote my book. Okay, so anyway, my point is today, point number one, we are seeing policies that are based on the assumption that teachers are to blame for all that is wrong. right? So we see policies that are based on the assumption that teachers are to blame for all that is wrong. So I was coming up with my notes while I was sitting on the airplane, and I had to come up with this way of how am I going to remember my great examples of policies that are doing this. And so I came up with this rhyming scheme. Okay? So my examples are longer day, merit pay, and data display. So longer day, Chicago. Chicago has a new mayor as of last year, right? Rahm Emanuel. And one of Rahm's biggest pushes since he got elected and it continues today is to lengthen the school day. So our mayor and many other reformers argue that Chicago has one of the shortest school days in this nation. And so how should we try to improve what's going on in Chicago? We should lengthen the day, right? And this is looking very likely, right? This is looking very likely that we're going to lengthen the school day. So research, of course, does not tell us, right, that longer school days correlates with better education. And even more compellingly, I like to point to some of the most elite schools in this country. And in Chicago, the school we like to point to is the University of Chicago Lab School, because this is where the current mayor sends his kids, it's where President Obama sent his kids. What is going on in the University of Chicago Lab School? Well, it does not have the longest day, right? It does not actually meet records around length of day, and nor does it even have high amounts of contact hour, right? There's recess in Chicago, in the University of Chicago Lab School. There's study hall, right? In other words, it's not the case that the University of Chicago is an example of how extended teacher contact is going to lead to more learning, right? Research does not suggest that the quantity of time is what matters. Research will suggest much more that it's the quality of time, right? But why do I think that this is such a compelling argument? Why do I think that it has so much kind of politician support as well as public support? It's because it's buying into a very kind of persuasive, compelling image of what's wrong with schools, right? If you think that, or not if you, what am I trying to say? The notion that lengthening the school day is a solution to our problem is based on the assumption that the teachers are simply not working hard enough while they're teaching, right? And therefore we need to lengthen the day. Let's make another parallel with the second example of merit pay. Merit pay is kind of, it can look in several different ways, but for me a summary is that you look at how students are performing in your school and then it can affect your salary or compensation, right? Merit pay. This is a form of positive reinforcement, right? What we're basically doing is incentivizing teaching, right? We think that if we can incentivize teaching, it's going to raise learning. Well, what is this based on? It is clearly based on the assumption that we need to incentivize something that that is not happening well enough, right? That is not happening well enough, perhaps by choice. In other words, it's based on the assumption that maybe teachers are just lazy, and if we can incentivize teaching, that might make them want to work harder, right? Isn't that what this whole kind of policy proposal is all about? And the flip side of that, negative reinforcement, is the third initiative, which we saw most clearly last week in New York City, and this is data display, right? I had a hard time coming up with something that would end with a, A. So my colleagues in Southern California helped me come up with data display. So what's going on in New York? So in New York last week, the press decided to join with reformers to publicize student data, test data, right? So you can now look up by individual teachers' names, right, how students are performing by test scores. And what's the assumption here? It's a very parallel assumption, right? It's that embarrassment can drive improvement, right? Embarrassment can drive improvement. Why? Because the problem is that teachers are simply not trying hard enough. And if we can make them want to try harder, either by incentivizing or by threatening to embarrass them, maybe that's actually going to drive improvement, right? Longer day, merit pay, and showing data. These are very much based on parallel logics, right? Well, the blaming of teaching, that's not what I was trying to say. I was trying to say these policies actually lead to the deprofessionalizing and the weakening of the teaching force, right? And that leads to my second point, is that the consequences of deprofessionalizing teaching is a more inequitable, or the consequence of deprofessionalizing teaching is a more inequitable public school system. Okay? The consequence of deprofessionalizing teaching is a more inequitable public school system. And how do I make that argument? There are at least two ways that I think of how current policies are driving the bifurcation of teachers and teaching. And so I come up with these two models, right? One is what I call 2 routes for teachers, and the other 2 routes of teaching. Okay? So 2 routes for teachers, what is this all about? Earlier I was saying that it's become kind of commonsensical that markets are going to drive improvement. This is what all choice programs are based on, this notion, right? That if we can proliferate the alternatives out there, the options out there, then that's going to make people want to work harder. It's like grocery stores in the neighborhood, right? It's the competition that's going to make us be more innovative, be smarter, and work harder, right? So too with school choice, or charter school programs, or vouchers, and so on, right? And so too with teacher preparation, right? So it was a quarter century ago, so in the 1980s, when we first heard people using language like the monopoly of teacher prep programs, or what one person called the ed school cartel, right? How universities are dominating the teacher prep world. And why is teacher preparation then therefore weak? Because of this dominance, right? Because of this monopoly. And so we need to infuse it with options, right? Well, the proliferation of alternatives is really seen within the past decade, right? And especially in the past few years. And this is with the, primarily with the fast-track alternative teacher certification programs, right? The Passport to Teaching, Teach for America, and so on and so forth. So what is significant though as we look about the impact of programs like that? Well, where are the Teach for America and other fast-track alternative certification program graduates being hired, right? They are not being hired by the most elite schools. Overwhelmingly, they are being hired by the most struggling schools, right? And I think, so when people say, hey, the creation of the fast-track programs is a way to improve teacher quality, we should be skeptical when the people who are claiming that are not the ones who are actually hiring the people from those programs, right? We should be skeptical of people who are proposing changes that are really for only the other people's children and not for their own, right? So Lois Weiner tells us that actually this is a global phenomenon, right? That across the world we're actually seeing the same thing that's happening in this country, where the teachers who are getting less preparation, less coursework, and less supervised field experiences are being placed in the most struggling of schools. And it's the teachers who actually have the most coursework and supervised experiences, the most advanced degrees, that are being placed in the most elite schools, right? She calls this 2 tracks for teachers, right? Similarly, there's also 2 routes into how we differentiate and bifurcate teaching, right? And so some examples I like to give are what happens in current reforms with the schools that are struggling most. Schools that are struggling most, that have to be turned around, they are moving towards things like scripted curriculums. They're moving towards things like less teacher autonomy. They're moving towards basically schools that look nothing like or the exact opposite of the most elite schools. So let's go back to University of Chicago. Let's go back to University of Chicago. So University of Chicago Lab School has unionized teachers. It does not have long school day. In fact, it has less instructional or contact hours because it has recess and study hall. It does not have scripted standardized curriculums. It's locally developed curriculums, right? It does not spend enormous amounts of time in test prep, right? It actually has very rich, broad, interdisciplinary curriculums, right? All the things that we who study education would say, absolutely, these are the things that we need to be seeing in school, right? This is what strengthens learning, right? All right, struggling schools lead to more scripted and narrow curriculums. The elite schools actually have locally developed curriculums and much teacher autonomy. In other words, why is this significant? Because the reforms, the things that we're saying we need to do to schools that are struggling are not actually making them look more like the most elite schools. And this is another thing that we should sort of use as a guide to help us be quite critical and skeptical of reforms, right? If any time a reform is coming at our way that is all about making the schools of other kids look even less like the schools of the elite, we absolutely should be skeptical, right? And that's exactly what's happening today. Okay? All right, this leads to my third point. The sorting of teachers parallels the sorting of students. And so here I like to think about conversations where I hear people talk about how schools are all about providing equal educational opportunity. Schools are all about leveling the playing field. Schools are all about preparing people, all children, to succeed and to compete and to whatever, right? This is often the language that we hear, right, from our politicians, from our reformers, from the media, whatever. Okay. Well, what's the reality? The reality is that schools really were never about equal educational opportunity, right? From the very beginnings in this country, public education was for only certain groups of students. And as we were forced to integrate our schools, we created more and more indirect and subtle ways to sort them, right? Such as through tracking. Schools have always played primarily a sorting function in our society, right? And these are arguments that people have made on various dimensions of diversity for well over a century, right? So folks like Carter G. Woodson talking about miseducation of the Negro, right? About how schools sort by race. Joel Spring makes similar arguments about American Indian boarding schools, right, in this country. Gene Anion talks about sorting by social class, right? Working class students preparing them for working class jobs, schools in wealthy communities preparing students for leadership and managerial jobs. Jonathan Kozol makes a similar argument about how school funding absolutely impacts the quality of education that students are receiving, right? Sadker and Sadker make arguments about how schools sort us by gender, particularly by developing in us a particular gender consciousness, right? A particular place that we think we're supposed to fit within gender hierarchies in society. And there's much research that can point to many other dimensions of diversity and social groupings, right? So the fourth point then, we don't often see this bigger picture of sorting. And why is this, right? So if we have this long history of sorting in this country, if we have even globally phenomenons of sorting, right? Lois Weiner talks about the traps of teachers, but even if we look at the research by folks like Linda Darling-Hammond on schools in Finland, right? Everyone talks about the great schools in Finland. Well, what's going on in Finland, right? Finland does not have scripted curriculums. Finland has locally developed curriculums, right? And so on. Many of the things that actually I was talking about with the Chicago Lab School, you can also see in the schools in Finland, right? So bifurcation, right? We're actually launching into reforms that are making the masses of our schools not look like what we already are recognizing as the top schools, right? Why is this? Well, one reason I think that we should keep in mind, that's not really what I'm trying to say, one concept that I think we should keep in mind is the concept of hegemony, right? This is exactly what hegemony would have us expect, which is that there is always some symbol that masks the structural reality, right? And it's the contradiction that allows oppression to continue to play out, right? This is the heart of hegemony theory, right? So without a structural analysis, though, we're more likely to buy into neoliberal ideologies that tell us that market solutions are going to solve all problems. Without structural analyses, we're more likely to individualize the problem. And that's exactly what's going on, right? Because we don't see the bigger problem, we're quick to individualize the problem. And there's some great research by an organization called Frameworks Institute that actually shows us why this might be happening. So if you were to Google Frameworks Institute, they have issued a series of reports that culminated in 2010 that I think reflects to us or reveals to us what has become the common sense of education today. So what they did is they ran a bunch of studies, focus groups, polls, whatever, to try to figure out what does the everyday American think about when you use words like education and schooling and reform. And what they argued is that the everyday American, this is I think it was the first thing that they talk about in the report, and it's absolutely the thing that stands out to me. When we use words like education, there's a particular image that seems to pop into everyone's minds, and it's the image of the classroom. When you talk about education, the image that pops into people's minds is this. One person is standing up, who supposedly knows the most and is talking most of the time to all the students, right? The classroom setting is what pops into people's mind. So when you talk about problems with education, what do we see as the problems with education? It's clearly the problems with this figure, right? This is why we have such a hard time talking about systemic or structural issues with education. It's because the common sense, the gut reaction, is to picture the individual, right? That's become the common sense. And fixing education then, we can talk all we want about funding inequities. What are people going to come back to? They're going to come back to their memory of that one bad teacher who really, or that one great teacher who really made all the difference in the world, right? They're going to come back, in other words, to the individual. And that's exactly what we see going on. So, I want to end on an up note, right? So we're trying to point to what can we do. There are 4 things that I think we can do to try to push back on what's going on. So my first argument is that we need to reframe the debate. We need to reframe the debate. So if the debate, if the sort of common sense of education has been framed very narrowly, right? To think about education as very much an individualistic enterprise, as to think about the problems, to think about the solutions in very market-based economies, then clearly part of our job needs to be to expose the bigger picture, to get people to kind of talk about education in much more complex ways, right? And here I draw a lot on the work of George Lakoff. Are we in Berkeley? Yeah, we are in Berkeley. I was just giving a talk at UCLA. I was like, you all work with, and I have to remind myself, no, he's not at UCLA, he's actually here at Berkeley. So George Lakoff, right, very influential in some of my earlier writings, such as in Selective Common Sense, right? Sorry. But anyway, George Lakoff talks about sort of the power of frames, right? And it's something that many of you who are either in debate teams or coach debate teams are also very familiar with, right? That the goal is to get your opponents using your language and your terminology, right? And a great example that he gives is the brilliance that people who are supporting and pushing for tax cuts, they're brilliant in how they framed that debate. Because his argument is that people who are pushing for tax cuts got a lot of people using the term tax relief. Well, tax relief sets up taxes as a bad thing, as something that we need relief from, right? So how can you possibly win the argument that we don't need tax relief, right? That was a very smart framing. And his argument is, therefore, to kind of make progress, we cannot be engaging in debates on the terms of people that have been very smart at framing it, right? We actually need to reframe the debate. We need to get people to think about taxes not as a burden that we need relief from, but as maybe a social investment, right? And so his push is, how do we get people to talk about taxes and conceptualize it in that frame rather than in the dominant one? And there are so many other examples, really there are any examples, healthcare, war, prisons, that we can kind of, where we should be kind of stepping back and asking ourselves, well, how has this debate been framed already? What is the dominant framing that is driving conversation? And how is it that I can never therefore win and convince people that my policy proposals are better if I remain within that frame? Right? So one example that I like to give of how a group of us were trying to do this kind of public reframing is with an organization in Chicago called CREATE. So if you were to go to createchicago.blogspot.com, you can see more about this organization. CREATE stands for the Chicagoland Researchers and Advocates for Transformative Education. It formed a year ago when the mayoral campaign was kind of in full swing. So we've had decades of Daley administration in Chicago, right? And when Daley announced that he was not going to run for mayor again, the city just was like, it was lost. It was like, no Daley? And you just had this huge number of people putting their name in the hat, right? Celebrities, politicians, and grassroots organizers. So what was interesting about a year ago was a bunch of us were kind of talking about how even the grassroots organizers were saying the same things about what was wrong with schools and what we need to do to fix them, right? We need to hold teachers accountable, we need to hold principals accountable, we need to get parents more involved in schools, we need to measure learning more and tie everything to those test scores, right? It was the same kind of arguments being made. And so about 6 professors from pretty much every university in Chicago came together to form this network. And our goal was to see whether, speaking from research, we were able to impact the public conversation, right, to reframe the debate. So in March of 2011, we issued a brief that was basically about what we call the myths and realities of school reform. And what we tried to do was take some of the most common things that we were hearing from the politicians and say, here's what the research says is wrong about those statements, right? Longer school day, here's what the research tells us about that, right? Merit salaries, here's what the research actually tells us about that, right? And here's what the research suggests is a better alternative. What that led to was actually more conversations with the union, right? So Chicago Teachers Union then, over the summer, embarked in this year-long campaign with CREATE to try to, basically the union said, hey, we have a bunch of research topics that we want some research on, that we know that if we were to issue the research brief on it, no one's going to pay attention. It's like, well, of course you think that, you know, you're the union, right? But what if an sort of independent group of this loosely come together kind of network of faculty were to actually say, as researchers, here's what we think the research is telling us. Well, we thought that it would be kind of an interesting thing to see what would actually happen. So last month we released our first brief, and it was about testing. We had a brief that basically said, here's what we think of as the history, the science, the impact, and the alternatives to standardized high-stakes testing. Standardized norm reference testing is actually what we're looking at. We are about to issue a brief on tax redistribution. In Chicago, we have this whole thing called TIFs. I don't know, TIFs. What does this TIF stand for? I can't remember. Anyways, something that's basically a form of tax redistribution. We're going to have a brief in April on school safety. And it's because, as with many districts around the country, Chicago's response to trying to make schools safer is with further policing and criminalization, right? So we're trying to say, no, actually, we need to think about safety in as much more along the lines of restorative and transformational justice. And so on. This is sort of the initiative of CREATE, right? It's a small initiative, right? It is not solving all the problems, but it's one way that I can think of for academics to try to step outside of what we normally think of as the role of university people, right? One of my mentors and guides is the late Eric Rofez. And Eric Rofez was once giving a keynote lecture at a conference where he said, the identity of the academic, of the university researcher, is very much an assimilationist one, right? We've created this profession that actually not only discourages us from, like, let's say, writing for the newspaper, but highly places the most value on things that reaches the least amount of people, right? So what matters the most in our profession? It's writing for the academic journals, right? So his argument is we need to take back that identity. We need to define it very differently. We need to embody it very differently. What would it mean for the academic to be the same thing as, or to consist of, the public intellectual, the grassroots organizer, the commentator, the strategist, the whatever, right? That's his urging, and I think that's absolutely what we're trying to move towards with this initiative of CREATE, and I'm hoping that many more people engage in these kinds of actions. So the second thing that I think that we can do is collectivize. So there are two examples, or two groups that I think are great, have some great examples of collectivizing in the recent history. One is what actually started on Monday in British Columbia. Everyone following British Columbia? So on Monday, British Columbia Teachers Federation started their strike. And if you read the reasons they went on strike, it's very, very eye-opening and inspiring. Because usually when we think about strikes, we think about people going on strike, and primarily what's forefronted is compensation and stuff like that, right? The majority of issues, though, that the union is arguing they're going on strike for has to do with learning conditions, right? So their argument isn't that this is about kind of compensation. Their argument is that what we are striking for is to push back on the policies that we think are hurting our ability to teach. Right? It's all about the learning conditions. They're reframing, in other words, what it means for unions to speak out and what it means for us to engage in labor negotiations. Right? Now, improving teaching conditions and learning conditions is a part of contract negotiations. Right? I mean, laborers would say this, unions would say this has always been the case. But I think their particular framing, if you look at their promotional materials, their kind of PR materials, it, I think, talks about this in a way that I have not really seen happen very often with strikes. The second example of teacher unionizing and collectivizing is what's happening in Chicago, and also what's not happening in New York City. So New York City is UFT, right? And not some, but if you get on some of the listservs like GEM, Grassroots Education Movement, right? Daily you will see people talk about UTF, I think, right? Basically the Union of New York City's public schools. The New York City Public Schools Union is seen as very much working hand in hand with the leadership of the school district, right? So they're not actually seen as a voice of progressive change. So too with the Chicago Teachers Union maybe 2 years ago. Right? This was the major criticism, that there doesn't seem to be a voice of kind of advocates of teachers and advocates of students, because the union seems to be speaking very much hand in hand with the leadership structure and the powers that be. So within CTU was this, or is this caucus called CORE, Caucus of Rank and File Educators. It's a very radical caucus that decided that they are going to put together a slate and try to take over the CTU, and they did. So last year they won, and they now run the CTU. The CTU has a very different, the kinds of work they do is obviously very different, but also so too is their relationship with the school district, right? So collectivize, we need to redefine who we are as unions, and also redefine the kinds of work that we think we're supposed to be doing, right? What counts as our work, right? I think that that's what these two examples are showing us, right? A second example of collectivizing can be seen at a website called unitedoptout.org. Unitedoptout.org. This is the website of the National Opt-out Movement, right? Which is a bunch of parents saying, you know what, we need to get organized and sort of push back on standardized testing by opting out of non-essential tests. And that's exactly what this movement is all about, is informing parents about which tests are not essential and what are your rights in terms of whether or not your children actually have to take them, right? There are a number of both nationwide and global movements to push back on high-stakes testing, and you can see other examples at a website called fairtest.org, fairtest.org. My third point builds on what I was just talking about, which is that we need to think about our work in the form, as a form of movement building. We need to be thinking about building movement. And what am I trying to push back on? Well, many people on the left, the sort of progressive, liberal voices, have been saying that the problem with liberal organizing for the past few decades is that we don't seem to think about our work in terms of movement building. That we tend to think about our work in terms of discrete actions that lead to legislative gains. Right? Discrete actions that lead to legislative gains. And what also characterizes leftist kind of movement is that it's very much shaped by identity politics, right? So it's very much shaped by my community, however I define the mine, engaging in certain kinds of actions that's going to lead to certain kinds of legislative gains or litigated gains. And this is exactly the framework by which many people have been critical of the Occupy movement, right? So when the Occupy movement was going on, when Occupy Wall Street was happening, people were saying, liberals were saying, well, what are we actually accomplishing, right? If you talk to the people who are sitting at Wall Street, they're unable to articulate their goals. It's not clear what their goals are. It's not clear what they're pushing for. And then once the major occupies have ended, we look back and we go, what did they actually accomplish? Did they accomplish anything? And I am very persuaded by people who look at the Occupy movement and say, it was a failure if you remain within a particular framing of what it means to engage in activism. Right? So if your framing of activism is about legislative gain, then yeah, actually it was a failure, right? They did not accomplish that. But maybe that wasn't their goal, and maybe that's not how we should think about activism, right? Because one thing that they did accomplish is they made much more, as a household word, things like the 1%, right? Things like seeing myself as part of the masses, right? That's been a powerful reframing, right? And if you also think about the civil rights movement, right? Another huge movement in our country that spanned several decades, there were many, not only legislative failures, there are not only many failures in the civil rights movement, there are also so-called successes that many on the left are highly critical of and see as not really successes, right? Things like Brown, things like the Civil Rights Act, right, are highly contradictory gains, right, we could argue. And so what is it then that makes the civil rights movement such a powerful guide? Well, it's perhaps the notion that the gains were, or the goals were not simply single pieces of legislation or single court cases, right? Is that it was about sort of reframing what we think it means to be a democratic nation, reframing the place that we see the civil rights and the place of diversity in that nation, right? Things like that, right? It's sort of shaping public consciousness was as important as gains. And in fact, if you think about conservative organizing over the past quarter century, this is exactly what some of the most prominent conservative leaders would argue. Folks like Grover Norquist, right, would actually say, yeah, you know, I'm not so concerned that that initiative did not lead to a whole bunch of legislative gains because that wasn't our goal in the first place, right? And in fact, that's exactly what he says about one of the education initiatives that was happening in the early 2000s, right? They had this goal of impacting state legislation around the country. They were not so successful. And so when he was asked, how do you make sense of this? His response was, well, our goal really wasn't only about legislative gain. It was about getting people to talk about the problems in education along these lines. And that's exactly what happened, right? And just to be a little bit more specific, this was an initiative around school funding. And the reframing that was happening with this initiative was to get people to think about how the problem with school funding was not that we didn't have enough. It was that we were being wasteful with what we had, right? And this is exactly the frame that I argue the federal government used very successful in its defense in the courts against states and school districts that were arguing that No Child Left Behind was an unfunded mandate, right? Their response, one of their major and I think savvy, smart responses was that yes, this legislation is underfunded, right, by tens of billions of dollars, some would argue. But the whole purpose of No Child Left Behind was to hold schools and states accountable, was to get us to be more efficient with the resources that are already there. So why would we put a whole bunch of new resources in there until we can see whether the gains we want to make happen are possible by simply being more efficient, right? It was a powerful reframing. And just as a side note, another powerful reframing that happened, I think, that is very instructive for us, is the reframing that happened around vouchers after Hurricane Katrina. Because up until then, choice, vouchers, charters were framed along the line with concepts of democracy, right? People were saying, choice is central to a democracy, right? Everyone should have choice. This is what it means to be in a democratic country, da, 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 da. So that's the language that we were relying on. After Katrina, that was not the language that we heard coming from the Democratic Party, right? So the Democratic Party were some of the strongest supporters of the so-called Katrina vouchers, right? This is when the federal government finally opened the doors to vouchers. And what was the argument that leaders like Kennedy were saying when he went back to his constituents? It was, well, we don't want to look like we don't care or have no compassion for the people who are in most need, right? The reframing moved from one around sort of democratic ideals to run around compassion, right? A very smart reframing, I think. Anyway, movement building, right? Movement building. We need to think in terms of movement building. And and I was also going to say, I wrote in my notes, tell them about my book. Okay, so, and that's because my book ends with some thoughts about how we build movement. Yes, those of you who are grad students, I just saw someone give a practice talk, and my advice to them was, you know, please don't cite yourself in your talk. It sounds very arrogant, but yet here I'm doing that because I think, yes, absolutely. We need as many tips as we can, but if you do not want to read my book, then here's another place that I think you should look at. It's a book by Eric Mann called Playbook for Progressives. Right? And Mann is also trying to help us map out what it means to build movement, right? What it means for everyday individuals to try to build movement, right? The fourth point I want to make about what we can do is we must reclaim, not disinvest in public education. We must reclaim, not disinvest. And this is a point that I come to after I was giving this a radio show interview. And I was talking about all of these things. And the person said, okay, so it sounds like the conditions, right, with public education right now is very dire, right? And it is. It's very demoralizing. It's very harmful, right? Demoralizing for our teachers. It's very harmful for our young people. And you also argue, he's telling me, that this is the history of public education. It has always served this very problematic function in society. So why are you arguing that we should further invest? Why are you saying that this is something we should fight for? And immediately the thing that came to mind is the call for prison abolition, right? There are many activists who are making a very smart, troubling, and brilliant call for us to not ask how do we reform prisons, But how do we imagine a society that does not have prisons? It's a very different question, and one that absolutely we should be asking, right? If your argument is that prisons are inherently oppressive, right, then the question isn't how do we make them better, right? The question is how do we get to think that that's a solution to our problems, right? So I was thinking, okay, it's like, should I make a parallel argument? And I decided, no, the parallel is not to give up on public education. Why? Why I argue is because, yes, public education has always served a sorting function. But public education has also always been a site of struggle. And in fact, public education has always been the site of struggle for defining who we want our next generation to become and what we think our future can be, right? And therefore, it is absolutely worth struggling and reclaiming public schooling. So these are the types of questions and challenges and opportunities that I urge us to grapple with as we engage in this important work. And I hope that this book and this presentation helps in that effort. Thank you very much.
So if I could go on and open it up for questions, please feel free to
Yes, you know me, Kevin. I just wanted to point out with one of the things you said, Kevin knows for a long time I have a friend that has been in charge of the opt-out program in Colorado, and he's helped families for over 10 years do that. And he just put on Facebook some recent numbers. Last year they had around 400 families that opted out their kids. This year it's like 12 or 1,300. So it has started to grow rapidly, and they've got a billboard there and everything. So I just wanted to add those numbers for you, Kevin.
I think it's so important that we know about what are the many kinds of initiatives on the ground that we can tap into, right? I think that's one of the hardest things is that we all feel like we're alone, right? Whether we're public school teachers, other school employees, whether we're parents, whether we're students, whether we're teacher educators, right? And there's so much amazing organizing going on that I think we need to learn from. Right?
You mentioned so many wonderful organizations. Is there any way we could get a list of some of the organizations you mentioned in your talk?
What a great question. Yes, I can send to Arturo a list.
That would be a wonderful, great start.
Great. Yeah. So many of these things happened since the book was written. Yes, it's not even in the book. Let's go 1 and then 2.
So NCLB waivers, what are your thoughts?
Well, I guess my overall thought is that NCLB and Race to the Top are so problematic, right? That really what we need to be thinking about is not how to band-aid these kinds of policies, but how to really radically revamp them, right? I was just having a conversation with a friend earlier today about how we're hearing more and more scholars of education, particularly kind of social justice, critical, multicultural scholars, arguing that we're seeing Obama's administration take education far worse than what Bush was doing under No Child Left Behind, right? And I think that in many ways that's true, right? We're moving more and more towards marketizing education, right? We're moving more and more towards thinking about civil rights and disparities as not structural, as not things that can be addressed structurally, right? And Race to the Top is just well, it was what one person told me. It was a move that the Republicans would have never tried to do. It was a Republican move that Republicans would never have tried to do, right? Which is to move away, for example, from formula grants, which is a way to not only make this all about market competition as a way to drive improvement, but it's also a way that requires certain kinds of certain things to be written into your proposal in order to be funded. Things like how are you going to outsource a huge amount of money in a really short period of time? Outsourcing have to be done. You have to show how you're going to spend this money, right? It was absolutely a move to privatize public education, right? You have to show how you're going to move towards things like using test scores in particular ways and opening up choice and charter program or frameworks, right? So I think that what we want to be kind of talking about more is how reforms and policies and initiatives are really about dismantling public education, right? It's about making it less and less a public endeavor, and how our response should not be about kind of tinkering with those tools, but saying, you know what, an initiative that is about kind of moving this away from being a public sector is an initiative that should not be tinkered with. It is an initiative that we should be completely abandoning, right? Yeah. You know, it's sort of like, so that's sort of my long-term, right? Short-term, it's hard to say, right? It's sort of like with, you know, high-stakes testing. What do you do with high-stakes testing? It's not going to go away anytime soon. And clearly, we disadvantage people. We disadvantage teachers if we don't prepare them to teach their students to succeed on tests. Just like we disadvantage our students if we don't prepare them to succeed on tests, right? Because the short-term is that this is the reality that we're in. I also think that it's not really all that short of a term either. I actually think that this is kind of a long-term thing too. So someone was asking me yesterday, where are we in terms of sort of this emergence of markets as the emergence of neoliberalism as kind of the operative ideology, right, that we're in right now. It's not only the, right, but it's absolutely a very dominant one. And my response was that I don't think we're anywhere near sort of the fading away of this as the way we think about social change, right? And the reason I make that argument is because nations around the world are moving towards what we think of as standards-based reform in the ways we're thinking about it, right? There are many ways to define standards and many ways to think about assessment. But the ways that sort of American educational history has come to think about and talk about standards-based reform in this very narrow way is exactly what we're seeing happening around the country. It's not necessarily the case that we're driving it, but I would say it is the case that, as with many aspects of globalization, it is the West that's driving this ideological transformation, right? Globalization is not only about the movement of sources of production and the movement of capital, right? Globalization is at its heart the movement of particular ideologies that allow certain groups to benefit in the ways that we've created our economies and cultural modes of production, right? So that's what's being exported. And that's why I would say we have so much more work to do, because I think that we're so early, I think, in what we're terming the standards-based reform. You had your hand up.
Really not a question, just an observation. When I heard on NPR yesterday, Arnie Duncan releasing these scores, the data about our students of color and expulsions and suspensions, and feeling like it was very much framed in the poor performance of principals and teachers.
Yeah, so much of the media has helped that, right? When Michelle Rhee was first coming into prominence as the DC Chancellor? CEO? Chancellor? Not technically a superintendent, but yes, she is a superintendent, but we didn't call her that, right? Time, when Newsweek or one of them did the magazine cover with the broom, right? And it's all about get rid of the lazy and incompetent principals, get rid of the lazy and incompetent teachers. And even when we don't use that kind of language so explicitly, I think about Mayor Rahm Emanuel's platform for improving education was about holding principals accountable, teachers, parents, and young people. And here's his solution for holding young people accountable is we threaten to take away their driver's license, right? If they're going to drop out of school, we take away their driver's license. So again, it's all about individualizing the problem. And actually, I was even having dinner with someone the other night where he was like, what are you out here for, LA? And I'm like trying to tell him about, this research that I'm trying to do. And we had this very long conversation about how, well, isn't it really the case that if the parents would just hold their kids responsible for studying and going to after-school tutoring and all that, our solution would be, and everything I would push back, it would be, yeah, but isn't it the case that if the parents, it kind of reminds me of how one time I was giving this workshop on how we need to make schools safer for gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender students. And I was giving all these statistics, as we often lead these kinds of workshops, right? Higher rates of bullying and harassment, its impact on grade point average, school retention, aspirations for future education, levels of depression, suicide, levels of alcohol and other drug abuse. And I expected people to respond the way that I responded, which is to say, this is so horrible, we need to do more to improve schools. Sorry, I think I need a little bit of water. One time I was giving a job talk, and I had my little water bottle, and I forgot to fill it. So I had this much water, and I was sipping the water. And finally, the professor who was sitting right there was like, "Give the man some water!" Thank you. So I was given all these stats, right? And I expected people to respond the way I responded, which was to say, this is so horrible, we need to be doing more. And someone in that room raised their hand and said, I'd be curious to hear how other people have responded when you give workshops like this. Because while I am personally very upset and it makes me want to do more to make schools safer, I could imagine someone saying, well, look, I always thought there was something wrong with being homosexual, and look at all the bad things that happened to them. Look at all the evidence, right? Contradictory facts don't always change our belief systems, right? In fact, one thing that we have, and I'll go to Anne, one thing that we have from communication research is exactly the notion that facts are often accommodated to fit into our belief systems, right? So although facts are incredibly important, and I think about the lobbying workshops, how to lobby. Well, what's one of the two major ways that we try to persuade our lawmakers? It's either personal story or facts, right? Data. Facts is incredibly important, but my reminder, what I have to keep reminding myself is that so too is getting people to kind of see the partialities of our own claims, right? Reframing the debate is as important as offering alternative facts.
Which gets exactly, I loved your talk, by the way, the whole talk. It gets exactly to what I was going to ask earlier. It sounds like the group in CREATE, that your approach was to show research says this isn't true, research says it isn't true. And I was wondering when you said that, whether those facts really are, I thought you were going to, leading right up to, this is how we reframed. But because I was kind of surprised to hear that this group under the influence of Lakoff did that. When Michelle Rhee came in here, we created a great chart in which we said re-speak, and then we reformulated it. We were trying to figure out. Yeah, right. But
Yeah.
Did you feel that that was effective, telling the facts? How many people really said, oh, merit pay really gets teachers not to like each other and talk to each other? Well, I'm going to be against merit pay. How many people really responded?
Yeah, so I have two responses. And one is, I think you're absolutely right, that the presentation of data was something that we went back and forth on. There are folks like my colleague and mentor, Bill Ayers, who kept saying, don't say that you are showing what the research really tells us. That's what we were trying to say. You all don't really have research to back you up. We know what the research is. We're going to back it up. We're going to tell you what the research really tells us. And actually, he didn't win that argument. So we did sort of say, this is what we think the research tells us. But I think you're absolutely right. Everyone can come back and say, how about this study?
Yeah.
Right? And one time I was interviewed by a journalist, right? And she said, you claim that longer school day doesn't have there's no evidence that supports longer school day. What do you think about this meta-analysis, right? So basically a lit review that one scholar had done, this is what the Chicago School District constantly refers to. They constantly refer to this meta-analysis. I can't remember, but some of you who are testing experts sitting in the room probably know what study I'm talking about. And I said, I'm not that familiar with that study. And she's like, well, then how do you make this claim? And I said, so then I had to kind of make this long-winded argument about how I don't think, we can go for days about you know a study and I know another one, and you know one and I know one, and that's not the solution, right? Our goal, though, with CREATE was to say, we feel that we've looked at the body of evidence, and the body of evidence is telling us this, right? So Bill Ayers doesn't agree with that. He's like, no, people will keep coming back. So here's my other thought, though. So I think you're right, that I think presenting research is not always going to be effective. I think for some people it's helpful, right? We're looking for those talking points that we want to be able to throw out. But what we did with the CREATE statement was actually to organize it around what we call 4 visions. And all of the revisions were our attempt to try to reframe. So for example, one vision was, reform should be, I totally can't remember, so I'm going to sort of guess at what we said. Something like reform should be research-based, not market-driven. Or testing should be da-da-da, not da-da-da. That's what we were trying to do, right? And that was our attempt at trying to put out there a different frame. And then the research was our talking points underneath that, right? Where under each one we then said, here's what the myths are, and here's what we think the research is.
But right there, when you said research-based, you're communicating that that's a good thing. Maybe could be democracy-based.
That's Bill Ayers' thing. He's like, forefront of vision, forefront of value, right? Because people will always have contradictory research, and in fact, we all have contradictory. We can all ourselves point to the contradictory research. And the reason he lost that argument is because we felt that the unique intervention we were trying to make was say that we are actually speaking from research, right? Because everyone is going to have their vision. And if we spoke from vision, we felt that what was differentiating us from, say, the Teachers for Social Justice group or whatever. I'm not saying that that's really a good rationale. I'm just saying that that's the rationale that seemed to persuade the group to go with the research thing. And ever since my talking to journalists who like challenged me on the research thing, I'm like, yeah, I can see why Bill is making an argument, you know? Always contradictory. I know we're kind of out of time though, but thanks everyone for this really important conversation.
So thanks so much for coming. There are books that are being sold by Modern Times in the back. Please, please, please help us finish the food. Thank you so much for coming in.